welcome to Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. So last week, I visited my friend Gray in Firebrand to learn how to make this knife here. To see how we did that, check out this episode here. I've had the week to use this knife and I love it. But most of you in the comment section below requested that I do a knife sheath build to go with it. And you know what? You're right. So that's this episode. Today, we're gonna be making a sheath to go along with this knife. And I think you're gonna like the little extra flair I add to this thing. Anyways, without much further ado, let's jump right in and level up this skill. Now you may notice that skill badge down there says woodcraft on it. I've made leather sheaths in the past, and I decided it might be fun to change this up a little bit. And since I've never made a sheath out of wood before, I think you see where this is going. We're gonna make a wooden sheath. Now the wood I chose was actually this piece of maple that I harvested from a tree that fell on my property last year. To start, I had to figure out where this knife would fit on that hunk of wood. So I laid the blade on the surface and just turned the branch until it laid mostly flat. I thought it would be really cool to leave as much bark on as possible so it looked really rugged, almost like a ranger made this knife sheath while he was sitting in front of his campfire. So I marked out how far that knife would sit into the wood, and also marked roughly halfway along the branch so that I could remove all of the unneeded material. Then started trimming this bad boy down. By securing it in my vise, it was actually really easy to get a clean cut right down the center. Then I double checked that I was leaving enough space for my blade to sit in before cutting that off as well. This leaves me with this nice half round piece of stock that is gonna end up being the body of my sheath. Okay, so if you've watched this show for any period of time, you know that I can't just make a simple thing. It always has to be a thing that does multiple things. It's like an illness. And damn it, this project is no different. Because I decided this thing would be way more cool if it was like a ranger multi-tool of sorts. So the first little addition I decided to add to this thing was one of these ferro rod fire starters. Super useful for starting your nightly fire and works really well with my knife. Although the plastic backing here kind of kills the vibe I'm going for. Luckily, I discovered that by just setting it in my vise and pulling, that grip actually just comes off nice and clean, leaving me with this bare rod here. Now, as fun as it is, nobody wants to be running around the forest with your bare rod all over the place. So to replace that handle, I decided to use this beef bone that I stole from my dog's dragon horde. After finding a drill bit that matched the size of my fire starter, I was ready to get started. I did begin with a smaller bit just to get the hole started. Then I moved on up to the correct size to make the cavity that my rod will slide into. Once that was all drilled out, I marked what that new handle shape would be, making sure the hole I made was centered in that space. Then I was off to my bandsaw to cut that shape out. Bone is surprisingly easy to cut and work with, but make sure you're wearing a protective mask as the dust is super dangerous. After cutting my shape out, I brought it over to the sander to flatten out the natural curve that's present in the bone, as well as generally refine that shape. This leaves me with a clean little shield-shaped handle for my fire striker. I decided to secure those two pieces together with a two-part epoxy, mixing the two liquids until they were combined completely, and then adding said mixture to the hole that I drilled out. Then I just smoothly inserted my rod. Get your mind out of the guts, child. While that adhesive cures, I thought this would be a good time to move on to the next feature of my ranger sheath. So let's say you're out there ranging. What do rangers do? Are they just like badass vagrants or loitering with style? Anyways, let's say you're out there and you find your knife is beginning to go dull. You need this thing. This is like survival tool number one. It has to be razor sharp. Pray tell adventurer, what's a forest vagrant ranger to do? Sharpen it. Obviously, get your head out of your ass. Come on. To do that, we're gonna need a whetstone. I decided to mount my scrapey rock to the front of that sheath so I could use it as a decoration as well as a tool. After tracing it where it will go, I went back over my lines with a razor knife. Then I went back in with a chisel and began removing all of that material. The razor cuts make it so that the shavings pop right out in the exact shape I need. Once I was down about 1/8 of an inch, I went back over that whole space with some sandpaper just to smooth it out. This whole process left me with this space that fit my whetstone so perfectly that it stays put even when the sheath is held just by the stone. That's eventually gonna need some kind of a strap or something to stay in because you wouldn't want to like lose your whetstone while you're wandering the wilds. But for now, I'm really proud with how tight that fit. Okay, at this point, my ferro rod is all cured and ready to be installed. After figuring out exactly where I wanted it, I did the same thing, tracing the shape, cutting it in with my razor, and then using my chisel to remove all that material. Finally, I hit it with some sandpaper to even it all out. This is a new technique to me, but look at how good that turns out. I am so pleased with that. Okay, for some reason, I didn't film it, but you see this circle right here? That's the spot I'm actually gonna end up seating that rod into. All I did was drill it out with the same drill bit I used on the bone. Doing this gives me a spot for my rod to slide into, letting my bone sit tight in the opening. Stop it. So bad. But look at how good that looks. I'm genuinely proud of that little innovation there. Though it isn't perfect, there's a tiny little gap at the top. To fix that, I just added a little bit of contact adhesive to just the last 1/8 of an inch of the handle. Then I mounted a small bit of leather to it. This filled in that space perfectly and gives the whole thing a tight finished look. Okay, from this point it's time to actually start turning this thing into a sheath that will hold the knife. To do this, I just position my knife blade onto the back of the wood and trace the shape in with my pencil. Then just more of the same technique I used before. Again, this gave me a super snug space, perfectly fitted to the purpose. I did notice, however, that the taper of the handle here where it goes into the blade kind of got a little in the way and pushed it out. To fix that, I just used some sandpaper to sand away a little swoop to match what my handle was doing. Now the whole assembly fits like a glove, super custom just for my knife. So snug, in fact, that it stays put until I decide to remove it, even without a backing. That said, it's still like a bit cumbersome at this point. It's still like block O wood shaped. So to streamline it a bit and to make it look more like a sheath, I just ran it over the belt sander and followed the shape of the blade. And this really helped with the overall shape and vibe, making it look like a sheath, rather than just a branch I have hanging from my belt. Okay, so at this point, that sheath is just kind of raw wood, and I want to make sure it's protected from the elements. So I busted out some of the ye olde linseed oil and rubbed it into the sheath to help protect it and seal it from the elements. Now I could have made this whole thing a wooden sheath and just added a slab of wood to the back to complete it. But then I had an idea and decided to add just one more fun little feature to this thing. So we have a whetstone to sharpen it up, but if you really want to hone a blade, you need a strop. So I figured it'd be really easy to incorporate some leather to the mix to make one. For my leather, I had this scrap of 8 ounce that had the perfect little belt loop ready to go. So I laid the sheath down onto that leather, in line with that little strip that'll become my belt loop, and traced out the shape. I also used my ruler to mark some straps to help hold the whetstone in place. Then I got to cutting the whole thing out with a sharp razor knife. Now originally I wanted to leave those straps long so they'd kind of fold over that whetstone and maybe have a little button or something to hold them in place. But then picturing it, I realized that the thickness of the leather and them overlapping themselves, it ended up being really bulky really fast. So instead, I just cut it so that there were these little tabs with holes in them that'll accept some cordage. That'll do the job instead and be much less intrusive. You'll see what I mean soon if you can't picture it, and I promise it'll make sense. First though, I wanted to add some decoration to that leather, so it's not just like big slab of leather slapped on the thing. So I moistened it and used my wing divider to give myself a nice border all around the piece. Then I cut that line in with my swivel knife and used my bevel stamp to give it some depth. To fill that space, I decided to use this basket weave stamp. Using it is super easy and it makes a really clean pattern. Not only that, but it's just a great way to fill up a large amount of space very quickly. And look at how slick that looks though. I love this stamp. Now to add a bit of color, I first hit the leather with some neat's foot oil, just to keep it supple and help the dye spread more evenly. Then I just dip dyed the whole thing to make sure there was even coverage. I'm gonna take a moment to pause for a quick little PSA here. If you're doing anything with chemicals or dyes or whatever, don't cheap out on the rubber gloves. I bought these super inexpensive gloves and they just immediately broke and stained my thumb. So you know, that's fun. Leather dye is truly cursed and I can't go through one project without getting it on my hands, I swear. Okay, so while that dye dries, I decided to jazz up the other pieces of the sheath just a little bit. Starting with the whetstone, I added this sticky vinyl cutout of my skill tree logo. I then used some black paint to just dab into that open space, covering it as evenly as I could. Then when the sticky vinyl is removed, the finished result looks super clean. To keep it from rubbing off, I hit the surface with a protective coat of sealer. Notice that there's some tape on the underside of that stone though. So to use a whetstone, you really want it to be wet. So I didn't want that sealer to like clog up all the pores and stop it from accepting moisture. I just kind of wanted that top section to be protected. Now while that dries, I decided to add this neat little diamond shape to the bone handle. After I was done tracing that in, I just used my Dremel with a carbide bit to carve it in place and give it some nice dimension. Then I cleaned the whole thing up with some sandpaper. Finally, I added some watered down black paint, just as a final wash to make the whole carving stand out and dirty the piece up a bit. Now I have my skill tree symbol, the diamond that's present in the middle of the tree and on my badges, and also the whole thing is made out of a tree. Branding. Perfect branding. Alright, so now that it's dry, let's get back to that leather bit. This I hit with some resist, and then went back in with an antique paste just to really make those stamp details pop. Once wiped away, the darker pigment stays deep in those details, making them really stand out. Sweet, with that done, we can go ahead and just put this thing together. First, I position the sheath where it would sit onto that backing, and then remove the top section, leaving the knife where it'll go. By tracing out the knife, it gives me a clean border to know where to apply my contact adhesive. Adding it to the leather, and then to the back of the wood, and then of course waiting the required 10 minutes for it to set up, I was able to marry the two pieces together perfectly, making a super secure bond. Damn, this thing looks slick though! Still, I never trust contact adhesive to hold things together by themselves. I was contemplating adding like tack nails or something to hold the leather into place against the wood, but then thought it would be fun to add a little bit of extra visual kind of rough interest to the whole thing. The thought was to actually sew that back on with some leather cordage. To get this done, I first used a wing divider to mark out where the holes would go. Then I went back in with my drill bit and drilled out the holes at an angle so that the bit exits along the edge of the top. I'm not gonna lie, this scared the hell out of me. I was so worried I'd ruin the whole thing by just making all of these ugly little holes in the front of it. But I soldiered on using some leather cordage to whip stitch around the edge of the sheath and lock that backing into place against the wooden top. Then to end it off, I just folded the cordage around itself. And I really love how this looks. I was so worried, but it did end up adding more like a rustic appeal, like something an adventurer would be kind of stitching together in front of the fire. Totally the vibe I was looking for. Though to stop that cordage from unwinding, I decided to use a needle and some thread, just to really lock it in place by tightly winding it around the ends, and then tying it off. Now we can really see how this is gonna look. First setting my striker into place, then seating the whetstone in its designated spot. To hold that into place, I used some more cordage and just passed it through those holes in the leather tabs that I have coming around the sides. These not only look good framing my little tree symbol, but they also do a great job holding that stone nice and snug. And the most important bit, the knife, which slides right into place and fits perfectly. Oh, it looks so good! For the final touch, I punched holes in the belt loop right at the bottom of the knife handle and through both layers of leather. This allows me to thread some more cordage through, to not only hold my knife into position, but also lock in that loop, giving me a way to hang it on my belt. Alright, now, check out how slick this thing is. First off, of course, it serves its primary function, which is keeping my knife safely tucked away. What's that you say? Night is falling and we need to get a fire started? No worries, friend. I just pull out my trusty ferro rod here, and faster than you can say Woods Wanderer, I'm showering sparks onto tinder and getting a warm fire going for the night. Now what are we gonna do around said fire to pass the time? Well, I have been noticing my knife's been getting a little dull lately. How about we just pop out our trusty whetstone here? After giving it a good dip in some water, I got to sharpening my knife for tomorrow's adventures. But let's take it a step further and get this thing really sharp. All we gotta do is untie our belt loop here and tie the cordage so that it makes a loop at the top. Now you can attach said loop to a tree branch or something and use the leather as a strop to really hone in that blade. Then when you're done for the night, the whole thing easily goes back together and we're ready for tomorrow's aimless meander through the wilds. This thing is functional and rustic and I love it so much. I was for sure out of my comfort zone with a lot of this, especially kind of drilling through, but man, I love how that came out. I'm curious though, what would you have added to your own little rustic adventurer's knife sheath? The aim here was not to make it bulky, so I really didn't want to add too many extras, but let me know what you think. Also, if you like what you saw here, why don't you consider giving me some of that like it love, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't release new content. Oh, one last thing I wanted to touch on. Some time ago, I made a lantern that looked like a flower. Recently, I was contacted by Little Wing Fairy Art, who is actually the originator of the technique that I used. I didn't know that, but after speaking with her for a bit, she was very friendly. It was clear that she totally came up with it. Now, I would never knowingly use somebody's custom techniques without giving them credit, so I went ahead and took that video down. Also, as recompense for my mistake, I offered to do her one better and tell you guys about her business. She not only makes some of the most amazing lanterns, but check out these badass like fairy wings and stuff. She is a super lovely person and an absolutely talented artist. So be sure to check her out. I'm gonna leave her Instagram, where a lot of her art is, and her website in the description below. All right, that about wraps it up. I've got a woods to wander. In the meantime, though, keep leveling up, you. You stay to the end screen. YouTube loves it when you do that. It is a great way to support this channel. Another great way to support the channel is by joining these incredible people's noble ranks. These are my Patreon members, and without them, none of this could happen. And let me shout out our newest high tier level Patreon members: Shayala, Jeremy D. Christensen, Connor Watson, Jacob Miller, Nathan Welch, Professor Wawa, and S. Cody. Again, you all absolutely mean the world to me, and we could not have this channel if it wasn't for your generosity. If you like what we do here and want to support, consider joining our Patreon, link in the description below. Otherwise, you can watch one of these videos here, and that'll support us too. Select one of them quickly though, for I am out of whiskey on this episode.